What happens when you become so wealthy that you outgrow the laws of any nation? You don't just buy property, you buy a country, deep in international waters and remote Caribbean chains. The world's ultra-wealthy are using advanced legal structures to purchase private islands and transform them into something resembling unrecognized sovereign microstates, complete with private security forces, custom tax arrangements, and a degree of separation from global authorities that most people will never experience. This isn't just luxury real estate. It's a quiet retreat from the modern nation-state itself. To understand this phenomenon, you have to start with geography, because not every remote island works for this purpose. The ultra-wealthy gravitate toward a specific set of regions, each offering a different combination of legal flexibility, physical isolation, and political stability. The Bahamas sit at the top of the list. With more than 700 islands and cays, many of them uninhabited, the archipelago offers something rare: proximity to the United States combined with a regulatory environment that has historically welcomed offshore wealth. Islands like Musha Cay, once owned by illusionist David Copperfield, demonstrate the model: a private landmass, accessible only by private aircraft or boat, with its own staff, its own infrastructure, and effectively its own rules of daily life. Belize offers a different appeal. Its barrier reef shelters hundreds of small islands, known locally as cays, many of which can be purchased outright by foreign buyers with minimal restriction. Belize's legal system, a hybrid of British common law and offshore-friendly statutes, allows buyers to structure ownership through international business companies, shielding the identity of the true owner behind layers of corporate paperwork. Then there's the South Pacific. Islands across Fiji, French Polynesia, and the Cook Islands offer something the Caribbean cannot: extreme distance from major population centers. Some private islands in this region are more than 1,000 miles from the nearest commercial airport. For an owner seeking true seclusion, that distance is the entire point. It isn't just about privacy. It's about making outside interference, whether from journalists, regulators, or process servers, logistically and financially difficult. What unites these regions isn't just natural beauty. It's a kind of legal terrain. Each jurisdiction offers some mixture of weak enforcement capacity, favorable corporate law, and physical remoteness that, when combined, allows a private owner to build something that functions almost like a state within a state. Local governments still technically hold sovereignty, but in practice, day-to-day life on these islands often unfolds according to rules set by the owner, enforced by the owner's staff, and rarely observed by anyone outside the perimeter. It's worth noting that legal sovereignty is never actually transferred in these purchases. No private island buyer becomes head of state, and no nation cedes its territory. What changes is the practical reality on the ground. Remote geography, limited government presence, and private wealth combine to create pockets where the rule of law exists more on paper than in daily enforcement. If geography provides a seclusion, maritime law provides a mechanism. And nowhere is this more visible than in the practice known as flags of convenience. Under international maritime law, a vessel, and in some interpretations, certain floating or semi-permanent structures, can be registered under the flag of any nation willing to grant registration, regardless of where the vessel actually operates or who actually owns it. Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands build entire registries around this principle, charging modest fees to register foreign-owned ships under their flag in exchange for minimal oversight. For decades, this system existed primarily to serve commercial shipping, allowing companies to reduce labor costs and avoid stricter safety regulations imposed by their home countries. But the same legal logic has been adapted by individuals constructing private maritime estates. Superyachts the size of small cruise ships, megayachts with helicopter pads, submarine garages, and permanent residential quarters are registered under flags like the Marshall Islands or Malta, placing them under that nation's legal jurisdiction rather than the owner's home country. Why does this matter? Because once a vessel is operating under a flag of convenience, the enforcement authority over what happens on board, within certain limits, shifts to the flag state. Labor laws, safety inspections, and in some cases tax obligations follow the flag, not the owner's nationality or the vessel's physical location. For a billionaire who spends much of the year aboard a floating estate anchored near, but not within, a nation's territorial waters, this creates a genuine legal gray zone. Some private island owners have taken this further by combining stationary maritime structures, including permanently moored barges and floating platforms, with their island holdings. By keeping certain assets technically classified as vessels rather than fixed property, owners can sometimes avoid the building codes, environmental regulations, and property taxation that would otherwise apply to permanent structures on land. This is not a perfect loophole, and it has limits. Territorial waters, generally extending 12 nautical miles from a coastline, still fall under the sovereignty of the nearest nation, and most countries retain legal authority to board, inspect, or seize vessels suspected of criminal activity regardless of their flag. But within those limits, flags of convenience create a layer of jurisdictional ambiguity that sophisticated owners and their legal teams have learned to navigate carefully, often using it to delay, complicate, or entirely sidestep regulatory scrutiny that would be immediate and unavoidable on the mainland. Owning the land and controlling the flag is only part of the equation. The next layer is legal architecture, and this is where things become genuinely sophisticated. Most private island purchases are never made by an individual directly. Instead, ownership is routed through a web of holding companies, trusts, and international business entities, often domiciled in jurisdictions specifically chosen for their corporate secrecy laws. The British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and increasingly Belize itself allow the creation of companies whose beneficial owners never appear on any public record. The island, on paper, is owned by a company. The company is owned by a trust. The trust is administered by a corporate services firm that has no obligation and often no legal ability to disclose who ultimately benefits from the arrangement. This structure exists primarily for one purpose: insulation. If a lawsuit, a creditor claim, or a government investigation targets the owner personally, the actual property sits several legal layers away, owned not by a person but by an entity that may itself be owned by another entity in an entirely different country. Unwinding that structure to attach a judgment can take years, and in many cases, foreign courts have no jurisdiction to compel disclosure at all. Some owners go further, establishing what amount to private regulatory frameworks for their islands. Employment contracts for staff are written under the law of the jurisdiction where the holding company is based, not the law of the island itself. Disputes are resolved through binding arbitration clauses that route any conflict to private arbitration panels in cities like London or Singapore, rather than local courts. Effectively, anyone who works on or visits the island agrees, often without realizing it, to operate under a legal system the owner has functionally designed. This is where the language of sovereignty starts to feel less like exaggeration. While the owner has not created a recognized state, they have created something close to a private legal ecosystem. The local government retains technical authority, but in day-to-day practice, contracts, labor conditions, and dispute resolution all happen according to rules the owner's legal team has constructed, enforced not by police but by employment agreements, arbitration clauses, and the basic fact that almost no one present has the resources to challenge them. This kind of structuring is not, in itself, illegal. International business law permits this exact architecture, and major financial centers profit enormously from facilitating it. But for outside observers, including journalists and regulators, it creates a frustrating reality. Ownership becomes nearly untraceable, accountability becomes diffuse, and the question of who is actually in charge of a given island can take months of legal investigation to even partially answer. Legal insulation only goes so far if the physical perimeter isn't secure, and this is where private islands begin to resemble small fortified territories rather than vacation homes. Private security on these estates has evolved well beyond a gated mansion model familiar to mainland luxury real estate. Many island owners now contract directly with private military and security firms, the same companies that provide close protection details for heads of state and Fortune 500 executives operating in unstable regions. These contractors are typically former Special Forces personnel, hired not just for personal protection, but for full perimeter defense, surveillance operations, and rapid response capability. The infrastructure reflects this. Modern private islands frequently feature radar systems capable of tracking approaching vessels and aircraft from miles away, thermal imaging cameras that operate around the clock, and motion sensor networks covering every approach to the shoreline. Some owners have installed underwater sonar systems originally developed for naval applications. designed to detect submersibles or divers attempting to approach undetected. A precaution that sounds extreme until you consider that several high-profile island owners have been targets of kidnapping plots or extortion attempts in the past. Communication security is equally aggressive. Many of these properties operate independent satellite communication networks, bypassing local telecom infrastructure entirely. This serves two purposes. It ensures the island remains operational even if local networks fail, and it makes external surveillance of the owner's communications significantly more difficult for any outside party, including government agencies, attempting to monitor activity on the property. Counter-surveillance technology has become a quiet arms race among the ultra-wealthy. Signal jamming equipment, capable of blocking drone reconnaissance and disabling tracking devices, is now a standard feature on the most secure private islands. Some properties employ electronic countermeasure specialists whose entire job is to sweep for hidden recording devices, detect unauthorized drone incursions, and identify any attempt at electronic eavesdropping, treating the island less like a residence and more like a piece of classified infrastructure. The result is a physical and electronic perimeter that, in practical terms, can be harder to penetrate than many small government installations. Local police forces in these regions are often underfunded and under-equipped compared to the private security details guarding the islands themselves, creating a strange inversion where the wealthiest residents control more raw security capability than the government technically responsible for protecting them. While individual billionaires perfect the private island model, a smaller group of tech entrepreneurs has tried to scale the same underlying idea into something far larger. Entire cities designed to operate with minimal government interference. The concept, often called a charter city, involves negotiating with a host nation to carve out a special legal zone where a private entity, rather than a national government, writes most of the operating rules. The most prominent real-world example is Prospera, a special economic zone established on the Honduran island of Roatan under a now-controversial legal framework known as ZEED, which allowed designated zones to adopt their own civil law, regulatory structure, and even certain judicial functions separate from mainland Honduran law. Backed by Silicon Valley investors, Prospera was marketed as a laboratory for alternative governance, offering reduced regulation, fast business incorporation, and a separate legal system for residents and companies operating within its boundaries. The project has faced significant legal and political turbulence. Honduras's government later moved to repeal the ZEED framework entirely, triggering an ongoing legal dispute, with Prospera's backers pursuing arbitration claims against the Honduran state worth hundreds of millions of dollars under international investment treaties. The episode illustrates the central vulnerability of the charter city model. Unlike a private island, which relies on remoteness and legal insulation, a charter city requires the ongoing cooperation of a host government, and that cooperation can be withdrawn. A parallel effort has unfolded at sea through what's known as seasteading, the idea of constructing floating, modular settlements in international waters, beyond the reach of any nation's legal jurisdiction. The Seasteading Institute, founded with early funding from PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel, spent years promoting the concept before pivoting toward more modest floating city partnerships with coastal nations rather than fully independent ocean settlements, largely due to the engineering and legal obstacles of operating permanent structures in international waters. What both experiments reveal is a consistent ambition among a subset of the ultra-wealthy, not simply to avoid taxation or regulation individually, but construct entire alternative systems of governance, scaled up from the private island model into something resembling a privately operated city-state. So far, none of these efforts have achieved genuine independence from existing sovereign authority. Every charter city still exists within, or in negotiation with, a recognized government. But the underlying logic that governance itself can be treated as a private product, a service offered to residents the way a corporation offers subscription, represent a meaningful ideological extension of the private island concept. None of this infrastructure, the islands, the maritime registrations, the private legal frameworks, would matter much without the financial system that supports it. And that system runs through the global network of tax havens. Offshore banking centers like the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore, and Luxembourg form the financial backbone, connecting private island ownership to the broader wealth preservation industry. The mechanics are straightforward in concept. even if the execution is deliberately complex. Income generated from investments, businesses, or assets is routed through holding companies registered in low-tax or no-tax jurisdictions. That income is then often reinvested or lent back to entities the owner controls in higher-tax countries, structured as loans rather than income, which can significantly reduce the tax owed in the owner's home country. Private islands fit neatly into this architecture because they're rarely treated as personal residences for tax purposes. Instead, they're frequently classified as corporate assets, owned by the same offshore holding structures used to manage the owner's broader wealth. Maintenance costs, staff salaries, and even security expenses can sometimes be structured as legitimate business expenses for the holding entity, reducing taxable income elsewhere in the owner's portfolio. The scale of money moving through the system is difficult to overstate. Various estimates from international tax researchers and organizations like the Tax Justice Network and the OECD place global wealth held in offshore financial centers somewhere in the range of $7 to $10 trillion, though precise figures are inherently difficult to verify given the secrecy these jurisdictions are designed to provide. What is verifiable is a pattern. International efforts to close these loopholes, including the OECD's Global Minimum Tax Initiative agreed upon by more than 130 countries, have moved slowly and face consistent resistance, often from the very jurisdictions whose economies depend on offshore finance. The private island, in this context, functions as more than a retreat. It becomes a kind of physical anchor for an entirely offshore financial existence, a place where an owner can live, work, and conduct business, while almost every dollar associated with that life flows through entities designed never to touch, and therefore never be taxed by, the country where the owner actually holds citizenship. So where does this all lead? As global regulators slowly close the gaps, sharing financial information across borders, tightening beneficial ownership disclosure rules, and pursuing coordinated tax enforcement, the private island system represents something increasingly rare for the world's wealthiest individuals: genuine distance from the reach of any single government. It's worth being honest about the limits of this escape. No private island owner has achieved actual legal sovereignty. Every island remains technically subject to laws of the nation that holds territorial claim over it. Every offshore company can, in theory, eventually be unwound by a sufficiently determined investigation, and every flag of convenience still answers, however slowly, to international maritime law. The sovereignty here is functional, not legal, built from remoteness, legal complexity, and financial scale, rather than any genuine transfer of governmental authority. But functional sovereignty may be exactly what the ultra-wealthy are after. In a world where regulatory enforcement is unevenly distributed, where some governments lack the resources to challenge sophisticated offshore structures, and where physical remoteness still meaningfully limits oversight, building a life mostly outside the reach of any one jurisdiction has become not just possible, but for a small number of people, a deliberate long-term strategy. As international cooperation on tax enforcement and beneficial ownership transparency continues to advance, these structures will likely face increasing pressure in the years ahead. Whether private islands and offshore architecture evolve into something even more elaborate, or whether tightening global regulation eventually closes the gap entirely, remains an open question. For now, scattered across remote stretches of the Caribbean and the South Pacific, behind layers of corporate ownership and private security, a small number of the world's wealthiest people continue testing exactly how far from the modern nation-state a person can actually get.